Well, let's take you back to Cape Town. Now, Newzroom Afrika's Latashia Naidoo has been covering that debate on the fallen soldiers and joins us now. So many issues were raised there, Latashia. I mean, a lot of them, of course, being the same issues that people have been raising over and over again, and it must be underscored as well, that have issues that have not been disputed by and large. I don't know what your guest made of the debate, whether he thinks he and fellow MPs like really debated this issue exhaustively, especially after the Defense Minister, NG Motshekga, did make some revelations about what happened ahead before the deaths of our 14 soldiers, and without, of course, telling us what it is exactly that they did to really ensure that those lives were not lost.
Yes, Vuyo. Well, some really interesting questions arising from this debate. But like you mentioned, maybe the MPs have not probed nearly enough. Like you mentioned, the historical involvement of the SANDF in this war has never been questioned. But there are so many questions that still, following this debate, remain unanswered, particularly for the families of those 14 SANDF soldiers whose remains, we heard, are decomposing as they're still not repatriated to South Africa. They're currently, we're told, still in Uganda. But one of the most important outtakes I've managed to establish from this debate today of the National Assembly was the lack of accountability, particularly from the Department of Defense and Military Veterans and the Commander-in-Chief, President Ramaphosa himself, with regard to those innumerable questions of why our troops are still in the Eastern DRC. Why have they not been brought home? Why is South Africa's involvement in this conflict still ongoing? And why, especially, where our troops essentially sent on a peacekeeping mission, but were completely under-resourced and outgunned. And as a result, 14 soldiers have now lost their lives as a result of this conflict. But here to speak to all these questions and more is Athol Trollip, an MP for ActionSA, who was a participant of this debate. Athol, thank you for speaking to us. You had some very choice words, particularly for Minister of Defense, Angie Motshekga, with regard to calling for her being fired from this role by the end of today, and also calling for the immediate return of those SANDF soldiers still fighting in the battle lines in Eastern DRC to be brought home immediately.
Now, look, first of all, this conflict is intractable because it's about territory and it's about valuable minerals under the earth in the Eastern DRC. But what confounds us as South Africans, and especially ActionSA, is that there's a dearth of leadership when it comes to this deployment. And last week I attended a joint defense committee meeting where the minister and the deputy minister and the generals were being grilled by members of parliament. I just looked at Bantu Holomisa, who's the deputy minister. He's a general himself. He just sat there with his mouth closed. He looked as bemused as we were. He witnessed a department being defensive and in denial about what has happened. So you ask some questions. What are we doing about the mortal remains of our soldiers that have fallen there? Well, first of all, their families must be distraught because the bodies are decomposing in the Eastern DRC and are still not back. And it's been more than 2 weeks now. That's a matter of grave concern. Secondly, there's no proper casualty evacuation plan. And the Minister of International Affairs, who was much more confident today than the Minister of Defense was, he said our troops can't be brought back because they'll be exposed to ambushes. Now, that's a serious concern because we should be leveraging and mobilizing our whole defense force to get our troops extracted from where they are now. We don't know whether they're refugees. We don't know whether they're prisoners of war. We know that M23 is controlling their existence in their camps. They are feeding them, they're giving them water, they're having food once a day, they can't wash their clothes, they're having a real miserable time there. So what we really are faced with here is a defence force that is incompetent, incapable, under-resourced. This is a question paper that I asked the question to the Minister on the 16th of November, where we opposed the additional 2 billion rand budget for the deployment of these troops. ActionSA opposed it because we said it won't make any difference. She answers and says the actual amount required is over 4 billion. So our troops were sitting ducks. They needed 4 billion. We budgeted 2 billion and sent them to their deaths. That's a real problem. And she says here the money would be spent to provide military health support, defense intelligence, unmanned aerial system, fixed wing, rotary wing aviation. There was none of that support.
I thought you've called for the minister to be fired, and that's something that was echoed by a number of MPs, particularly opposition MPs, at this debate. Do you think that's going to happen? I know we've discussed the potential of a commission of inquiry post these deaths in Goma, or a further defense review. Are any of those expected to happen, including the resignation or the removal of the minister from her position?
Well, I gave her two options. She should either resign or be fired by the end of the day. Now, we know Cyril Ramaphosa is notorious about holding ministers to account. He just doesn't do that. And it's unlikely that Angie Motshekga will resign. But the issue is that she has options, resign or be fired. Our troops had no options. They were set up there to fight and die for no good reason. So I believe that nothing will happen, but that is actually the legacy of the ANC. We as voters in this country need to understand that if we want people to be held to account, we need a whole new government. The GNU is not up to it. I must commend some of the GNU partners today for standing up for what is right. Others were just following suit and mimicking what the governing party was saying. But we need accountability of political leaders and military leaders, and we're not going to see that with the ANC-led government.
And finally, following this debate, 23 speakers, if I'm not mistaken, and you spoke to International Relations Minister Ronald Lamola being more robust and energetic in his response to the cabinet today, following what you've described as a lackluster response from the minister. Do you think that watching this debate today, the families of those fallen soldiers have gotten the answers that they need and deserve?
I think certainly haven't got the answers they deserve. And we have seen a systematic decline in competence and experience of defense ministers over the last 30 years. Angie Motshekga destroyed education. She has no military experience. She should not be the the Minister of Defense. So if Cyril Ramaphosa doesn't heed the call today of replacing this minister or firing her, we want him at the very least to institute a commission of inquiry so we can get down to who is responsible for ill-fated deployment, poor leadership in combat, and who's responsible for the loss of lives and why it's taken so long to repatriate the bodies.
Thank you so much, Athol Trollip, ActionSA MP. Well, Vuyas, you've heard some really fiery words there from Athol himself, who spoke to the lack of leadership that seems to exist within the Department of Defense and Military Veterans, which, of course, we know is headed by Minister Angie Motshekga. Athol being one of a number of MPs who have called for the minister to be removed from this portfolio simply as a result of the failures to capacitate the SANDF soldiers who have been sent to the Eastern DRC to participate in what was called a peacekeeping mission, but many have questioned the actual viability of their role, accusing the government, particularly the Commander-in-Chief, Cyril Ramaphosa, and the Minister of Defense in failing the soldiers by sending them to a battleground ill-equipped, without any support in terms of ammunition and medicine, but also sending them in a lot of descriptions today from the members of parliament into a war zone to die, essentially, Vuyo. So despite this debate happening, a lot of questions still arise as to what next. We know that those bodies of those 14 fallen soldiers are being repatriated this week. We're told that it will those bodies should return to South Africa by Thursday, but it's a waiting game at this point, Vuyo.
So many unanswered questions indeed. Latashia has been monitoring that debate in Parliament this afternoon. But